I noted a couple things here. So Hannes Bernhard asked a good question about non-English characters. And there was some back and forth. Teniel, do you want to talk about IAU former resistance to non-English characters?
Sure. So I'd like to first say that it is in the IAU naming rules that special characters are essential, fundamental parts of words in different languages, and they will be used. Um, like I said in the comment, though, in practice, in the past, some IAU members have preferred to use names without those special characters because of the issues with display, in different programs and such. Um, and I think it's just a lag on their part of keeping up with the fact that the technology has progressed to where it's not a problem like it was 10 or 15 years ago. We've approved several names have been approved in the last few years that have special characters. So I wouldn't use the word that they discriminate against them. I've had success pressing the issue during certain proposal reviews. So please propose names that have special characters. If it's a name that is so particularly well fitting for a feature, there's nothing in the rules that say that it can't be used. But also remember that the point of nomenclature is not for commemoration. So if there's say somebody wanted to use Motley Crue as a name, we can't commemorate Motley Crue. We could find some other band name that would be appropriate that doesn't have a special character, if that makes sense.
Sort of. There was a question also. I want to loop back around to Joshua. Nicely asked, and this is probably, let's let Barbara tackle this one, about getting underrepresented groups to suggest names. And I know, like, there's been some concern. Some Native American groups have actually been less enthused with people just sort of appropriating names and throwing them down without really any acknowledgement of their context. So can you speak to that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we should not be just going willy-nilly into other languages and cultures and pulling out names that we think are fun and interesting and help us learn about them. It's a partnership. The moon is a sacred place to a lot of people. It's not ours. It's not any one culture. So if we want to work with other nations, other cultures, other groups, then we need to work with them as full partners and not just go to them and say, hey, we want to take your names.
Let's see. So we've got a couple minutes here before we have a break. Everyone can get a cup of coffee before we come back. Open floor. If anyone wants to unmute themselves and ask a question that you didn't feel it might be benefit to have everyone listen to, please unmute yourself and fire away.
Yeah. Excuse me.
Go ahead.
This is Ross Beyer, SETI Institute, NASA Ames Research Center. Tennille, I asked a question in chat, but I think it went by. Your talk implied for the moon that there were kind of 3 brackets of size categories, so greater than 3 kilometers, 1 to 3 kilometers, and then 100 meters to 1 kilometer. Is that a distinct unit, and does it have different naming rules than the first name?
No. These are those. How do I say this? Those diameter ranges are only very general guidelines, and you can find those by looking at the database of historically approved names. So, by and large, it's the first names of generalized first names that are used for craters smaller than 3 kilometers. But there's a lot of overlap. And so the idea here is that the IAU, and I think we as a community, should sort of save important names, say Whitaker, Ewan Whitaker, for larger craters that might be more impressive to name than some 750 meter tiny crater on the moon. And so it's just a general guideline.
Thank you.
There was someone else, sorry, who was about to jump in with a question. Please go ahead.
Yeah, this is Fred Califf at JPL. I just want to comment on something that Barbara said about, not just appropriating some cultures' names. We were successful on this for Mars 2020. We landed in a quad which we had named Chaco Canyon, and we had actually a member of the Navajo Nation who was part of the mission team, and we worked with the Navajo Nation to get approval for a list of Navajo names that then we assigned to science targets, and that, I think that's a good example of how to do it right. It can certainly get very tricky, and we don't want to be appropriating anything unnecessarily.
Yeah, thanks, Fred. I neglected to say how we did do it right on March 2020. So thanks for bringing that up. And I'm just going to tack on to that as well, is that people are complex. People do great, amazing things, and people do super not good things. And one person can be responsible for doing great things and not great things. So NASA as a whole is moving away from using names, people's names for commemorating things like space telescopes as a famous recent example. I know that is the naming convention on the moon, but I think we all have to really dig into why we name things after people, and what good things and bad things that they've done, and be real honest about those things. It takes a really hard conversation, I think, that we didn't previously do.
I would say that the IAU is also leaning towards that with, if you look at the new themes for, say, Dimorphos, and some of the other bodies where we have themes that are names for percussion musical instruments or names of birds in mythology. That's a way to get away from this, the convention of naming things for people. And it allows us to have a more global representation.
And I think this is going to come up again too, and you gave a great example of how crew can informally name things. I think it's important to work with our crew as part of our science team. They're part and parcel of our science team, alongside our training for geology and understanding how to operate on the surface. If we're choosing a set of names or a naming scheme or just words that we can be using to help them come to crew's minds if they're searching for something to name something. It's easy to say that looks like a dump truck site, and we can all remember that. Oh yeah, that was a dump truck. It's it's more difficult when someone says, "Oh, that's Shorty Crater," because I just read that in a psychedelic book, that's copyrighted. Like there are ways that we have to work with crew so that they're not just tossing off things that are problematic or could be problematic.
Right.
I did want to shift gears 1 second here. So there was a question about, this one's to Jim Skinner. So basically, I'm going to paraphrase it. If we have digital maps, does scale matter?
Yeah, thanks, you guys. I love these conversations about nomenclature, by the way. I think it's incredibly important. So I don't mean to shift gears on this one. So hopefully we can have more conversations about that. In regards to scale, yeah, scale does matter. So we have a digital environment where we can zoom in and out of things. But if something is prepared at 1 to 15 million scale, and then you zoom all the way into 1 to 10,000 scale, those two things now are out of sync, right? And so we do have to, it is true that we can zoom in and out and we can use data, but to make things doable, you have to set a boundary and a scale and a projection, but that's a little more esoteric. So a boundary and a scale, and we have to be attending to the information that is available to you that is documentable at that scale. So yeah, scales come from printed maps, but they still matter because they bound your investigation and they bound your content, and they are absolutely as critical now, if not more so, than they ever were when we just have printed maps. So to say that a 1 to 1 million scale map and a 1 to 250,000 scale map and a 1 to 10,000 scale map, these are showing completely different information. The base information that's coming from it, you might be able to zoom across all scales and see that information in more and more detail. Jim, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I very much apologize for joining late, but I had an actual mission meeting which I had to go to. But so if this has already been covered, I apologize. The key for nomenclature for the traverses was letting the crew decide what to name things, because it's so important for them to have things in their mind. These are informal names, they're not formal names, okay? So look at the Apollo 15 map. That was a great example. I mean, and we had science fiction, we had, exupere, we had all sorts of things. And that was because the crew knew what these were because they'd named them, and that gave them like a real ownership, not only but for recognition as well. Not, oh, what the hell did they name that thing here or whatever? And those names went on the maps. So for traverses, I think it's important to actually abide by that if possible.
Sure, but Jim, we can also be working with crew to help pre-populate or pre-seed some of those ideas, right? It doesn't have to be spur of the moment, whatever they're thinking. They can.
Oh, no, they do it beforehand, well beforehand. When after the crew's chosen, when they, once you have a nomenclature beforehand, when you're making a lot of background maps, et cetera, so we can communicate with each other in some ways or another. But it's more the first briefing. Okay, one of the things we have to do here's the lay of the land. We have some landmarks here, craters and other kinds of things that we need you to think about names for. That's what I'm talking about.
I would say that is such an important consideration, that the crew should have that connection to the names for all the reasons you just said. The difference between now and the Apollo days is the almost immediate propagation of those names across the internet and the world. And for the crew and the naming scheme, for them to have just awareness of the impact of what some of those names might be, like Barb said about Shorty. Just that's an important consideration that maybe wasn't present back in the Apollo days.
We published actually for the media and briefed them on all the informal names. So I wrote many memos on that, and it was very, very successful, because actually it's quite a charming part of the mission. I mean, there were these exupere, the Little Prince, and Durin's Bridge, things from Tolkien and things like that. And the media was really excited about that because, hey, these astronauts have actual personalities. You know what I mean? They're creative and imaginative and well-read, and it reflects their exploration sense too. So I'm sure we can find a way, but that was the way it did get publicized in Apollo. And I think the other key thing is these did not stay. They were not IAU formally accepted names. Okay, a few became that way, but most of them remained informal, and I think that's fine personally.
Okay, let's pause there for a second. Alex, please go ahead. You had your hand up earlier.
One of the things I just want to highlight is that for the Jet 5 testing, we are playing around with nomenclature for the field sites that we're conducting our test simulation EVAs on, and we are creating not just informal naming conventions, but word banks also to brief the crew on, so that they have a go-to list while conducting their EVAs. So if they want to, specifically call out an area the way Apollo crew did, they have that's predetermined, or they already have an idea of where to go if something is just really intuitive to them. So it'll be interesting to see in execution how that turns out, and happy to talk more, probably at LPSC, about those results.